They can build cars, not tanks. That was what Hitler said in January 1941, his voice echoing off the marble walls of the Reich Chancellery. Around the long table, officers and ministers laughed. In their minds, America was a nation of advertisements and jazz, not engines and armor. A land of comfort, not conquest. He called them the merchants of luxury. That same evening, across the Atlantic, President Franklin Roosevelt sat in his study at the White House, the lights dimmed against the winter dark. The world was burning, but the United States was still officially at peace. Roosevelt picked up a pen and wrote a phrase that would become a turning point: the arsenal of democracy. His radio address that night carried across the country, to Detroit, Pittsburgh, Buffalo, cities that would soon roar like furnaces. In the factories of Ford and Chrysler, men in grease-stained overalls stood silently as they listened. The smell of oil hung in the air. A mechanic wiped his hands on a rag and said quietly, "We build cars for life. Guess we can build them for war, too." At that moment, America had barely 331 working tanks. Germany had over 3,000. The Wehrmacht was swallowing Europe mile by mile, its iron divisions rolling through fields that still smoked from the Blitzkrieg. Berlin saw the numbers and smiled. But numbers have a way of changing fast when a nation decides to wake up. By the summer of 1941, Detroit's assembly lines began to shift. Toolmakers replaced chrome with armor plate. Car doors became tank hatches. The same belts that once carried shiny convertibles now bore rough, angular hulls. Men worked 12-hour shifts. Women learned to weld. On the walls, posters read, "Speed is strength." To the Germans, it still looked like chaos, an uncoordinated mess of industry and slogans. Yet in that mess, something enormous was stirring. In Washington, an intelligence officer handed Roosevelt a report marked confidential. It read, "If mobilization continues at current pace, U.S. production capacity will surpass that of all Axis powers combined by 1943. The president folded the paper without a word. He knew it already. Across the ocean, the laughter in Berlin began to thin. The same men who had mocked American factories now read intercepted reports of new tank prototypes, of thousands of tons of steel leaving the Great Lakes every week. In a private entry in his war diary, a German industrial analyst wrote, "The Americans are not fighting yet, but their machines are marching." In the bars of Detroit, workers drank black coffee instead of beer. No one complained. Every street echoed with the sound of trains loaded with parts, whistles blowing through the night. Even prisoners eat in the morning, one foreman joked, watching his men gulp cold sandwiches beside the line. Another answered, "Then we'll eat after victory." By the end of 1941, the assembly lines that once built sedans were running around the clock. The pace was unnatural, inhuman, and unstoppable. Roosevelt visited one of the plants that December, the air thick with heat and metal dust. He raised his voice above the machinery and said, "What you do here will decide the fate of freedom." When he left, a reporter asked a worker what the president's visit meant. The man shrugged. "Means we build faster." In Berlin, Hitler was given an updated intelligence report. The tone was colder now, less certain. It estimated that American tank production could reach 10,000 units by the following year. He circled the number and wrote beside it, "Impossible." But the impossible was already taking shape in steel, oil, and human will. 2 years later, the Allies would cross oceans with an army of machines that the Reich had laughed at. And when the laughter finally died, what replaced it wasn't silence. It was the deep, relentless hum of American industry, the sound of a nation that had decided to prove the world wrong, the sound that would one day drown the Reich. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Detroit, February 1942. The city that once sold chrome and comfort now smelled of hot oil and iron dust. The streets were coated in soot, the factories alive through the night. The skyline glowed orange from furnaces that never cooled. Detroit had stopped making cars. It was now building war. They called it the arsenal of democracy, but inside the Ford and Chrysler plants, it felt more like organized chaos. Conveyor belts clanged, sparks showered from welders' torches, and the air was so thick with smoke it tasted metallic. The workers called it the fog of victory. At the River Rouge plant, A young engineer named William Newman stared at a blueprint pinned to the wall. He designed engines for sedans just 2 years earlier. Now his task was different. Create a tank that was fast, simple, and cheap. One the United States could build faster than Germany could destroy. The project had a name, the M4 Sherman. Newman wrote in his notebook, "It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to keep moving." The challenge was staggering. America had never built machines like this before. The steel supply was short, factories lacked tooling, and half the workers had never seen a tank up close. Yet they learned. Men trained machinists overnight. Women traded aprons for overalls, their hair tied in red scarves. Rosie the Riveter became a symbol before the name even appeared on posters. One of them, a welder named Eleanor Mason, wrote to her brother fighting in Tunisia, "You're out there fighting tanks. I'm in here building them. Every time my torch hits steel, I think, maybe this one will find you before they do." By the end of spring, the first Sherman rolled off the line. It wasn't elegant, a blocky, awkward shape compared to the sleek German Panthers. A worker wiped sweat from his brow and said, "She ain't pretty, but she moves." Another replied, "That's all she needs to do." The Army inspectors nodded. The tank worked. It was reliable, easy to repair, and, most importantly, could be built by the thousands. Within months, the assembly lines multiplied. The Chrysler tank arsenal alone produced nearly 1 tank every hour. Henry Ford's son, Edsel, walked through the plant one night, stunned by the rhythm of it all. "It's like music," he said, "only louder." But there was another kind of music, too, a darker one. Outside the factories, ration lines stretched down city blocks. Gasoline was scarce, coffee limited, sugar gone. People sacrificed quietly. Every gallon, every pound of steel went to the front. Still, morale stayed high. Detroit had become something larger than itself. It was no longer a city of workers. It was an army made of mechanics and fire. In August 1942, Roosevelt visited one of the plants. The moment he stepped inside, the noise swallowed his entourage. Steam hissed, engines thundered, hammers rang like bells. He raised his voice above the roar. "Gentlemen and ladies, every bolt you turn, every plate you weld, shortens this war." After he left, a young riveter turned to his foreman and said, "Then let's end it tonight." And they kept working. Through heat, exhaustion, and blackout drills, the machines kept rolling. Every time a new tank emerged from the end of the line, a siren wailed and the workers cheered. They called it the birth cry of steel. By December, over 25,000 tanks had been built, an industrial miracle. The trains carried them east to the ports, where they were loaded onto ships bound for Africa, Italy, and soon, Normandy. Across the ocean, German officers began noticing something strange. Every time they destroyed a Sherman, another seemed to take its place. Reports from the Africa Corps complained of endless replacements. One commander wrote, "We burn one, and 2 more appear the next morning. It's like fighting a factory." Back in Detroit, Eleanor Mason received a telegram. Her brother's unit had been saved when a replacement tank arrived mid-battle. She pinned the message to her locker and went back to welding. In Washington, Roosevelt received a classified report. U.S. production now surpasses Axis total output in armored vehicles. He smiled faintly. So much for Americans can't build tanks. And yet, as America built faster and louder, Berlin began to listen more closely. Hitler's laughter had stopped. In the ruins of Stalingrad, his generals whispered that the war had turned. They blamed the Russians, the winter, the fuel shortages, but the truth was simpler. The truth was steel. The truth was motion. The truth was that across an ocean, a city that once made convertibles was now building the machines that would crush the Reich. And the sound that reached Berlin that winter, low, rhythmic, unstoppable, wasn't the sound of guns. It was the sound of Detroit breathing. Berlin, January 1943. The snow outside the Reich Chancellery was gray with soot, the air sharp with cold. Inside, a low fire burned beneath portraits of past emperors. A young Luftwaffe officer entered the conference room, a stack of papers trembling in his hands. He placed the report on the table before General Jodl. The numbers were unbelievable. "American tank production," he said quietly, "has surpassed 25,000 units." No one spoke. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of a clock. Then, Somewhere in the back of the room, an older officer gave a short, dismissive laugh. Exaggerations, he said. They build toys, not weapons. But the man who laughed didn't look convinced even as he spoke. Everyone had seen the same newsreels. Long trains loaded with tanks crossing endless plains, factory smoke pouring into the sky like storm clouds. When the report reached Hitler, he underlined the number twice and scrawled beside it, "Impossible." Then he threw it aside. "They're bluffing," he said. "Americans have no discipline. They can't fight a war of steel." But thousands of miles away, under the blinding sun of Tunisia, the first Shermans were already proving him wrong. Captain Erwin Keller of the Afrika Korps wrote in his field diary, "Their tanks are crude, ugly things. But they come in waves. You destroy one, and another appears before the smoke clears." In the desert, that persistence mattered more than perfection. The German Panzer IV could outgun the Sherman, but the Americans could replace losses overnight. Mechanics repaired damaged tanks with the efficiency of factory lines. A British officer watching the same battles noted grimly, "They fight with quantity, not beauty. And quantity, God help us, wins." At the docks in Algiers, long columns of Shermans rolled off the ships, still smelling of factory grease. Soldiers joked that Detroit had more to do with the war than Washington. One American sergeant wrote home, "Every time we lose one, another arrives on the next convoy. I swear the Germans must think our tanks grow out of the ground." And maybe, in a way, they did, out of the soil of a nation that had turned every field and city into part of the same machine. Back in Berlin, a young intelligence officer named Hans Schulz studied the reports from North Africa. He saw something that others missed. It wasn't just the tanks themselves. It was the speed at which they appeared. "They're fighting time itself," he told his superior. "And they're winning." His warning went ignored. The Nazi high command believed in quality, in the myth of the invincible machine. The Tiger tank, the Panther, the precision of German engineering. These were symbols of superiority. They couldn't imagine that simplicity could triumph over brilliance. Yet the war was shifting. Every destroyed Sherman was a lesson in resilience. Every shipment from America was a message written in steel: "We will not stop." In February 1943, news arrived that Stalingrad had fallen. 90,000 German soldiers captured, the Sixth Army gone. The myth of the unstoppable Wehrmacht shattered in the snow. When Hitler heard the news, he locked himself in his study. Witnesses said he screamed, throwing maps and shouting at ghosts. "We were betrayed by weakness," he roared. But the real betrayal came not from within Germany. It came from the rhythm of an enemy that refused to slow down. That spring, the first Shermans rolled through Sicily, then Italy. They weren't faster or deadlier than German tanks, but they worked. They started in cold mornings, ran through mud, crossed rivers, and climbed hills the Panthers couldn't. A German mechanic, captured near Salerno, told his interrogators, "You Americans, you build tanks like you build toasters. Cheap, endless, replaceable." The interrogator smiled. "That's the idea." By the end of 1943, the Reich's industrial heart was straining. Allied bombers hit factories day and night. The fuel lines were drying up. And still, the trains from Detroit kept moving, black silhouettes against the dawn, heading toward ships that never stopped sailing. In a decrypted message that year, a Nazi logistics officer wrote to Berlin, "We cannot destroy what keeps rebuilding itself." In Washington, Roosevelt received a different report, the mirror image of the German one. U.S. tank production exceeds Axis combined output, it read. He looked up at his advisors and said quietly, "Now they'll understand." And in a dark room in Berlin, Hans Schulz, the young officer who had warned his superiors, opened a fresh intelligence packet from North Africa. On top was a photograph, rows of Sherman tanks stretching to the horizon. He turned it over and wrote on the back, "The enemy is not the tank. The enemy is the factory." That night, he walked home through a city already trembling under the threat of air raids. Above him, the searchlights cut the sky like blades. He thought of the endless trains across the ocean, the smoke over Detroit, the heartbeat of machinery that refused to stop. And for the first time since the war began, a German officer admitted to himself, quietly, almost reverently, that the future belonged not to the strongest army, but to the loudest machine. Because somewhere far away, under the glow of American furnaces, The war was already being decided. One bolt, one engine, one tank at a time. June 6, 1944. Before dawn, the English Channel looked calm, too calm. The waves whispered against steel hulls, hiding what was coming. Beneath the surface waited an army made of iron. The Sherman DDs, amphibious tanks that could swim. They were America's newest gamble, built in secret, tested in the gray waters off England only weeks before D-Day. Sergeant Tom Grayson from Cleveland sat behind the controls of his own Sherman, the turret sealed, the smell of fuel thick in the air. He'd been a mechanic before the war. He knew engines, not oceans. Now the ocean was his enemy. "Keep her steady," came the order over the radio. Grayson gripped the wheel tighter. Outside, the sea rose and fell, black as oil. The canvas screens that kept the tanks afloat rippled with every wave. One by one, the Shermans rolled off their landing craft and into the water. At first, it worked. They bobbed forward like strange metal boats. But as the wind picked up, the waves grew cruel. Grayson watched through the periscope as the tank to his left dipped once, twice, and vanished. "Number 3's gone under," someone shouted over the radio. Then another voice. "They're sinking one after another." He tasted salt in his mouth, from sweat or sea. He couldn't tell. The engine groaned, water slapping against the hull. "Come on, girl," he whispered, pressing the throttle. "Don't die now." Minutes felt like hours. The channel was littered with debris, crates, helmets, fragments of men. But through the fog, Grayson saw it, land. Normandy. The shore was close enough to feel its pull. He drove the tank forward, the treads finally catching sand beneath the waves. When the first shells hit the water, he didn't stop. The Sherman roared onto the beach, the propellers folding back as its treads bit into the wet earth. The ramp ahead was chaos, smoke, gunfire, bodies, cries. Grayson's tank was one of the few that made it. He swung the turret toward a German bunker and fired. The recoil slammed through his body like thunder. For the first time that morning, he realized he was still alive. By midday, the beaches of Normandy were lined with burning wrecks, half-sunk tanks, shattered landing craft, broken rifles. But mixed among the wreckage were the Shermans that survived. They pushed forward, slow and steady, clearing the path for infantry that followed. Grayson wrote in his journal that night, his hands still shaking. "We didn't land. We broke through." He wasn't exaggerating. The first waves of Sherman DDs had done what no one was sure was possible. They'd opened the gate to Fortress Europe. By the evening of June 6th, thousands of American soldiers stood on French soil. The air still stank of smoke and seawater. Behind them, the channel churned with the wreckage of failure. Ahead of them lay a continent waiting to be taken back, 1 mile at a time. In a report to Berlin, a German commander wrote, "They came from the sea in tanks. Tanks. We thought they were mad. Then we realized they were prepared." For Hitler, D-Day was more than a defeat. It was humiliation. The man who once mocked this soft, Americans now faced an army that had crossed the sea inside machines of its own making. Radio intercepts from that week recorded something new in German transmissions: silence. No laughter, no boasts, no speeches. Just terse, clipped voices reporting disaster. Grayson's tank sat on the hill overlooking Omaha Beach that night, its paint scorched, its tracks still caked with sand. He stepped out, listening to the waves. They sounded different now, heavier, older. Behind him, the men of his unit lit cigarettes in the wind. No one spoke. Later, when replacements arrived, they asked how it had been. Grayson said only one thing: like driving through hell and coming out the other side. Dawn broke the next morning over the beaches, gray light on gray water, quiet except for gulls. The invasion had succeeded. The road to Berlin had opened. From the sea to the sand, the Shermans had led the charge. They weren't invincible, but they were relentless, the machines that refused to sink, the soldiers who refused to stop. After that day, Hitler never again called Americans weak. He stopped calling them anything at all, because by the time he spoke next, the sound of engines, American engines, was already drowning him out. By 1944, there was no night in America. From Detroit to Chicago, from Pittsburgh to Los Angeles, the factories burned like furnaces that refused to sleep. Their windows glowed orange, their smokestacks spat fire into the dark sky. It was said that if you stood on a hill outside the city, You could tell which way the war was going by how bright the horizon burned. The war had turned the country into one enormous heartbeat of metal. In every city, the rhythm was the same. The clang of hammers, the hiss of welders, the thump of hydraulic presses. It was a language everyone understood. Eleanor Mason, who once welded the bodies of cars, now worked on armor plates for the Sherman. Her overalls were scorched with tiny burns, her hands cracked from heat. She'd stopped wearing gloves, they slowed her down. On her lunch breaks, she listened to the radio. When the announcer read casualty numbers from France, she whispered the same thing every time. Maybe the next tank will reach him. Her brother, Robert, was somewhere outside Cannes, fighting in one of the Shermans she helped build. She didn't know which one, but it didn't matter. Every machine that rolled off the line felt personal. Everyone could be his. The line never stopped. At the Chrysler Tank Arsenal in Warren, Michigan, engineers worked 3 shifts a day. The foreman barely slept. The sound of the presses never ceased, only shifted in pitch as one batch of steel was replaced by the next. To outsiders, it looked impossible. To the people inside, it felt holy. A journalist who toured the plant wrote, "It is as if Detroit has turned its soul into steel. Men move like machines, machines move like men. There is no border between them anymore." By summer, America was producing a new Sherman every 10 minutes. The factories moved faster than the front. When a battle consumed tanks in Normandy, replacements were already on the ships crossing the Atlantic. When the tanks reached France, the next wave was being painted, tested, fueled. The workers called it the war without sleep. Henry Ford himself visited one of the plants in July 1944. He walked the length of the assembly line in silence, watching hundreds of men and women work in a thunderstorm of noise and sparks. At the end, he turned to his foreman and said quietly, "If we can build cars for peace, we can build tanks for freedom." And they did. Every state contributed something: steel from Pennsylvania, rubber from Ohio, copper from Arizona, oil from Texas. The entire map of America was being smelted together, one rivet at a time. There was a saying among the workers: "If you can't fight, build." Some did both. Men wounded in combat returned home and took jobs in the plants, limping between machines, sleeves pinned where an arm used to be. One of them, a former tank driver named Joe Castillo, was assigned to test engines. He'd lost his crew in Tunisia, but refused to quit. "I couldn't save them," he told a reporter, "but I can help the next guys make it further." The press called them the Second Army. Roosevelt called them the beating heart of victory. But in truth, it wasn't heroism that drove them, it was necessity. The country had made a promise: no soldier would go into battle alone. And so, the factories became the nation's front line. At night, the sky over Detroit shimmered with the reflection of molten steel. The glow could be seen from miles away, flickering like the northern lights. Kids in nearby neighborhoods said it looked like the heavens were on fire. In a way, they were. The rhythm of the factories reached across the ocean. In the fields of France, tank crews said they could feel it, as if each engine's heartbeat was synced with the people back home. When they revved up before battle, some claimed they could almost hear the echo of the assembly lines. In August, a reporter in Normandy interviewed a Sherman crewman named Private Harold Webb. His tank was dented, scratched, streaked with mud. On its side, someone had painted the word Eleanor. When asked why, Webb smiled. "That's my sister's name," he said. "She builds them. I drive them. Guess you could say we're family business." By autumn, American production had become its own kind of warfare. Germany's precision factories couldn't compete with the chaos of democracy in motion. Engineers, students, farmers, and housewives, all working toward one impossible rhythm. In Berlin, a Luftwaffe analyst wrote a frustrated memo. "The Americans do not build war machines. They build replacements for war machines." By December 1944, over 50,000 Shermans had been built, more than all German tanks combined since the war began. When news of that number reached Hitler's headquarters, one of his aides hesitated before reading it aloud. The Führer listened in silence, then simply turned away. There was nothing to say. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, in a Detroit factory, Eleanor welded her last plate of the night. Her back ached, her eyes burned, her arms trembled from exhaustion. She looked at the glowing seam and whispered, "Hold, damn you, just hold." She stepped back, pulled off her mask, and wiped her face. Someone near her switched on the radio. The voice of a news announcer drifted through the noise. Allied forces have liberated Paris. The whole line stopped for a second. Someone cheered. Someone cried. Then the machines roared back to life, louder than before. In that moment, the war didn't feel distant. It felt like it was happening right there, in the blinding sparks, in the smell of burnt steel, in the relentless hum of work. And somewhere in France, her brother's tank moved forward again, its treads clattering over the ruins of a conquered town. In his next letter home, he wrote one line. "I think I heard your weld, Ellie." It held. The words reached her weeks later, smudged and creased from travel. She kept the letter in her locker until the end of the war. Because that was the truth of it. The factories fought just as hard as the soldiers did. Every clang of metal was a promise kept. Every tank was a prayer on tracks. And when they rolled into France, it wasn't just machines that crossed the ocean. It was faith, hammered, welded, and born in fire. They called it the Tiger. It was not a tank. It was a monster. 60 tons of steel, an 88mm gun that could pierce armor from a mile away, treads that crushed walls like paper. Its name alone sent fear down the Allied lines. Every soldier who faced it swore the same thing. You could hear it before you saw it. A deep, metallic growl rolling through the forest. Winter, 1944. The Ardennes. The last German counterattack, Hitler's final gamble. Snow muffled the world, but the forest shook with engines. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. Sergeant Tom Grayson sat inside his Sherman, breath fogging on the frozen glass. His tank was one of hundreds guarding a narrow road somewhere near Bastogne. He and his crew had been fighting since Normandy. The men were tired, the tank patched with scars, a welded record of every battle they'd survived. At dawn, a spotter shouted from a ridge, "Tigers!" 3 of them, moving from the east. Grayson's stomach dropped. The radio crackled with voices, orders, prayers, panic. Everyone knew what that meant. The Sherman was fast and reliable, but against a Tiger, it was like cardboard facing a cannon. Still, they didn't run. The first shot came from half a mile away. A flash, a whistle, then impact. The tank ahead of Grayson's vanished in an instant, flames licking the snow. His gunner swore and returned fire. The shell bounced off the Tiger's armor with a sound like a bell. "They're too thick," someone shouted over the radio. Grayson steadied his voice. "Then keep firing. Maybe we'll melt it." The Shermans moved in pairs, circling, flanking, trying to close the distance. Smoke filled the air, gray and bitter. Every time a Tiger fired, the ground seemed to jump. The snow was black with soot. The air stank of oil and burning rubber. Grayson's tank took a hit to the tread. The hull shook violently. For a moment, everything went silent inside, a silence that felt endless. Then his loader coughed and shouted, "Still alive." They kept fighting. They had no choice. From the treeline came the unmistakable sound of Allied artillery. Finally, support. Shells screamed overhead, slamming into the German formation. One Tiger turned its turret too slowly. Grayson's gunner took the shot. The shell hit the joint of the armor, right where the plates met. The Tiger burned. Inside the Sherman, no one cheered. They just stared through the smoke, breathing hard. Grayson wrote in his notebook that night, his hands shaking from exhaustion. "We didn't win by firepower. We won by staying put." That was the truth of the Sherman. It wasn't stronger or deadlier. It was stubborn. It survived because its crews refused to give up, and because, even when one burned, another took its place. German commanders sent frantic reports back to Berlin. "We destroyed 20 tanks, but more keep coming." Endless. One officer scribbled in the margin, "How can you win against a country that never runs out of tanks or men?" In the end, that was what broke them. Not any single battle, but the rhythm of replacement. For every Tiger that rolled out of a German factory, America sent 100 Shermans across the sea. The Tigers might have ruled the battlefield, but the Shermans ruled time. By January 1945, the great beasts were dying out. They were too expensive, too slow, too rare. Each one lost was a disaster. Meanwhile, Grayson's unit received 2 brand new tanks before the snow even melted. The tide had turned. A captured German lieutenant told his interrogator, "Your tanks are nothing special, but you have more of them than we have bullets." He wasn't wrong. When the Bulge finally collapsed, the road through the Ardennes was lined with burnt-out Tigers. Massive, black carcasses left to rust in the snow. Allied soldiers walked past them in silence, staring at the wreckage that had once terrified them. Grayson climbed out of his Sherman and touched one of the destroyed German tanks. The metal was still warm. "So this is the monster," he murmured. "Doesn't look so scary now." His gunner laughed softly. "Guess even monsters run out of gas." The truth was simpler. The Tiger was a masterpiece. But war doesn't reward masterpieces. It rewards what survives. The Sherman was smaller, thinner, imperfect, but it was everywhere. It crossed rivers, mountains, forests. It could be fixed with a wrench, fueled from a barrel, driven by anyone with half a day's training. And that was the real secret. America didn't just build tanks. It built endurance. By February, Grayson's unit pushed east through Belgium. The snow turned to mud, the nights to rain. The engines roared through it all, never stopping. Each mile brought them closer to Germany. Each battle brought fewer Tigers. Somewhere in Berlin, an exhausted engineer read the production reports and realized what it meant. They couldn't keep up. The math had beaten them. One tank at a time, one factory shift at a time. That was how the war was being won. And in the forests of Europe, surrounded by smoke and frost, Tom Grayson sat in the seat of his Sherman, hands black with oil, eyes red from fatigue, and finally understood. They weren't fighting against soldiers anymore. They were fighting against the last echoes of an empire running out of breath. The Tiger was still feared, but fear, like steel, eventually bends. And America, with its machines, its workers, its endless rhythm, never did. April 1945. Berlin was burning. The sky above the city glowed red, a fire so bright it could be seen for miles beyond the front. Streets that once echoed with parades were now canyons of rubble. The Reich was collapsing, brick by brick, breath by breath. Yet across the ocean, in Detroit, the night shift was still working. The war was nearly over, but no one had told the factories. In the foundries of Michigan, sparks flew like stars. Men and women stood at their stations, faces lit by the orange light of molten steel. Every few minutes, the ground trembled, not from bombs, but from presses stamping armor plates for tanks that would never leave the country. No one could simply turn it off. For years of motion had built a rhythm that felt alive, like the city itself was breathing through smoke and steam. A woman on the line, her hair tied in a red kerchief, said it best. "We started building to catch up. Now we build because we don't know how to stop." Outside, the snow was gone, replaced by the heavy spring air that smelled of oil and iron. The workers didn't speak much anymore. The radios whispered news from Europe, towns captured, armies surrendering, and finally, one morning, a single line. Berlin surrounded. There were no cheers, no victory songs, just the echo of machinery still pounding, as if refusing to believe it could end. Then, one night in late April, the news came across every speaker in America. Adolf Hitler is dead. In the factory, the sound of the engines slowly faded. One by one, the machine stopped. The silence that followed felt unreal, deafening after years of thunder. No one shouted or cried. They just stood there, hands covered in soot, listening to the hum die out. Eleanor Mason, who had spent the last 3 years welding tank hulls, looked down at her gloves, the same pair she'd worn since 1942. She whispered, "So this is what it sounds like when it's over." Her foreman nodded. "Feels strange, doesn't it? We fought this thing with noise. I don't know what to do with quiet." Across the Atlantic, Soviet tanks were entering Berlin. The city was a skeleton, smoke still rising from its bones. The Allied soldiers who saw it said it didn't look like victory. It looked like the end of the world. Back in Detroit, the night sky was gray with factory haze. The furnaces still glowed, though the orders had slowed. Production continued out of momentum, not command. The army hadn't yet said to stop, and no one wanted to be the first to suggest it. They kept building Shermans, 1,000 a week, though everyone knew the war was finished. It was as if the machines themselves demanded to keep going. The workers called it the habit of war. A young machinist named Walter Harris wrote in his notebook, "The war's over, but the factory doesn't know it yet." He wasn't wrong. The noise, the sweat, the sparks, it all felt safer than silence. America had fought its war not only with soldiers, but with shifts, quotas, and time cards. Now, without the war, there was only the waiting, the fear of what came next. On May 2nd, the last German forces in Berlin surrendered. By then, Detroit's presses had already stamped another 100 armor plates. The paperwork for new contracts was still sitting on desks, waiting for signatures that would never come. When the final siren sounded at midnight, signaling the end of production, it didn't feel like celebration. It felt like exhaustion. Eleanor stayed at her post long after the others had gone. She touched the still warm steel of the last Sherman hull and said quietly, "We did it. God help us, we really did it." She wiped her hands on her apron and left the factory. The night air was cold and still. For the first time in years, she could hear the city breathing, a slow, uncertain rhythm without the clang of machines. The streets of Detroit were empty, lit only by the dull glow of the furnaces cooling in the dark. Somewhere far away, men were shaking hands over surrender papers. But here, the victory felt heavy, industrial, made of smoke and sweat. In the coming weeks, the orders would stop completely. The machines would rust. The workers would return to their lives, though few of them could remember what that meant. A newspaper the next morning ran a headline in bold: "Hitler dead. War end near." Beneath it, a smaller line read, "Factories to reduce production." But the truth was simpler. The arsenal of democracy had done its job too well. It had built not only tanks and planes, it had built momentum. It had built identity. And when the engines finally cooled, America found itself standing in silence, surrounded by the echo of its own creation. In Berlin, fire consumed the last symbols of tyranny. In Detroit, the furnaces dimmed, but their glow lingered on the horizon, a memory of everything the nation had forged. The war had been won not by genius or glory, but by endurance, by millions of hands that refused to stop moving. And on that night, as Berlin burned and Detroit slept, victory was measured not in medals or speeches, but in the quiet hum of a country that had outworked the darkness. Summer, 1945. France, somewhere near Le Havre. The war was over, but the fields still looked like battlefields. Only this time, the soldiers were gone. In their place stood thousands of silent giants, Sherman tanks, row after row, stretching across the horizon. They were lined up neatly, like soldiers waiting for orders that would never come. Their engines were cold, their guns rusting in the sea air. Seagulls perched on turrets. Grass was growing between their treads. Captain Ray Morgan arrived that June to oversee what the Army called equipment consolidation. What it meant was simple: decide which tanks to save, which to scrap, and which to forget. He stood on the edge of the field, notebook in hand, staring at the metallic graveyard. He wrote one sentence in his report that day: "We built for victory. Now we build for forgetting." It was true. The arsenal of democracy had done its job too well. There were more tanks than anyone needed. The war had ended faster than production could slow. Every port in France was clogged with machines waiting for a purpose that no longer existed. The locals called it La Forêt d'Acier, the forest of steel. Children climbed on the hulls and played war among the ghosts of real battles. Farmers complained that the tanks blocked their fields, but they also left food at the gates, as if feeding some slumbering beast that had saved them. For the veterans who came to see them, the sight was harder to bear. Sergeant Tom Grayson arrived one hot afternoon, his uniform still pressed, though the war had taken years off his face. He walked slowly between the rows of tanks, running his hand along their dusty sides. Some still bore names: Eleanor, Detroit Belle, Lucky 7. Others had no markings left at all, just the dull gray of abandonment. He stopped beside one with a bullet hole near the hatch. It looked almost familiar. Maybe it was his, maybe not. He couldn't tell anymore. "These won the war," said a young officer standing beside him. "And now they're just scrap." Grayson nodded. They were never meant to last, just to keep moving. That night, in his tent, he wrote a letter to Eleanor Mason back in Detroit, the woman who had welded armor for the Shermans he drove. "Your hands built what saved my life," he wrote. "But now I see them lined up in silence, like monuments without names. I wish you could see them. You'd understand. We didn't just build machines. We built a heartbeat. And now it's stopped." He folded the letter, sealed it, and left it unmailed. There was no address to send it to. In the weeks that followed, American engineers arrived with cutting torches. The sound of their work echoed through the fields, sharp, bright, final. One by one, the tanks were dismantled. The armor was loaded onto ships, bound back across the Atlantic to be melted down, reborn as cars, bridges, or tools. A few were sent to allies, to Britain, to France, to the newborn nations rising from the ruins. But most were simply erased. Captain Morgan watched as one tank was cut apart, its thick armor glowing red in the sunlight. "We made them to last forever," he murmured, "and now we're unmaking forever." He wasn't the only one who felt the weight of it. Across Europe, massive depots filled with jeeps, trucks, and aircraft waited for disposal. Victory had created excess, mountains of machines without purpose. One American newspaper called it the pile of giants. And that's exactly what it was, a monument to industry, not battle. Proof that power alone wasn't enough to fill the silence that followed. By August, the fields near Le Havre were nearly empty. What had once been a sea of armor was now a graveyard of scorched soil and forgotten tracks. Only a handful of tanks remained, left behind because they were too damaged to move. Grayson came back once more before shipping home. He found one of those broken Shermans half buried in mud. He climbed up, sat on the turret, and watched the sunset over the Atlantic. He thought of the factories, the smoke, the noise, the people who never saw the war but fought it all the same. He thought of the nights when victory felt like a dream and of the friends who didn't live to see it. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, softly, he spoke to the empty field. "We thought they were immortal. Turns out they were just ours for a while." Somewhere back in Detroit, Eleanor Mason was cleaning out her locker for the last time. Her welding gloves, stiff with soot, lay beside a folded newspaper clipping. "Victory in Europe declared." She hadn't been back to the factory since it closed, but she still carried a burn scar on her wrist, a mark that time refused to heal. When she looked at the photograph of the production line, row after row of fresh Shermans, she smiled faintly and whispered, "You're free now." Because in the end, that's what those machines had bought, freedom. Not glory, not perfection, just the chance to stop fighting. The tanks that once roared through France were now quiet. The workers who built them had gone home. The fire that fed the war was out. But even in silence, the Shermans still stood for something. They were proof that willpower could take shape in steel, that a nation could turn its factories into an army, and then, when it was done, turn that army back into peace. The war had ended. The giants were sleeping. And as the sun set over the field of forgotten tanks, the world began, slowly, to remember how to live again. Decades passed. The world moved on. Cities rose from rubble, and the roar of engines faded into history books. But in one quiet hall at Fort Knox, a single Sherman tank stood beneath soft museum lights, its olive paint worn thin, its steel dented by time. A boy, no older than 10, stared up at it. His father stood beside him, hands in his pockets. "Dad," the boy asked, "is this the tank that won the war?" The man smiled. "No, son. The war wasn't won by a tank. It was won by the people who built it." Their voices echoed in the stillness. Around them were relics of an age that had defined a century, rusted helmets, faded blueprints, black and white photos of workers at assembly lines. One display case held a single object behind glass, a heavy wrench, its handle engraved with a name, Eleanor Mason. Next to it, a yellowed photograph, a woman in a welding mask, sparks flying around her. Beneath it, a plaque read, "Arsenal of Democracy, Detroit, 1942 to 1945. 49,234 Sherman tanks produced." The numbers didn't feel real. They were too large, too distant. Yet the smell of oil and metal still seemed to cling to the steel. Across the hall, a veteran stood silently in front of the tank. His hands trembled slightly as he touched the cool armor. He was old now, white hair, deep lines, eyes that had seen too much. The museum guide whispered, "He fought in France." He ran his hand over a dent in the hull and said softly, almost to himself, "She still works." The guide blinked. "You mean it could still run?" The man shook his head. "No, I mean, she still reminds us." For a long moment, no one spoke. The hum of the air conditioning replaced the roar of engines that once filled a continent. That tank, the M4 Sherman, had never been perfect. It was outgunned, out-armored, sometimes outmatched. But it was reliable, reparable, and most of all, it was everywhere. It rolled through the deserts of Africa, the hedgerows of France, the forests of Belgium, the ruins of Germany. It was the sound of persistence, not power. And that was the secret of its legacy. It wasn't built to be a monument. It was built to move, to push forward, no matter what. The veteran smiled faintly, remembering faces long gone, the hiss of the engine, the way the steel shook beneath his boots. "We thought the tank carried us," he said. But it was the other way around. On a nearby wall, a display showed a black and white photograph of a factory floor. Hundreds of workers, men and women, faces streaked with sweat, stood beside newly finished tanks, waving at the camera. The caption read, "The hands that built victory." Eleanor Mason's wrench lay beneath it, polished but untouched. In the reflection of the glass, her legacy met the boy's curious gaze. 2 generations, bound by the same story of labor, faith, and endurance. Outside, the sun set over Kentucky, casting long shadows through the museum's glass roof. The Sherman's silhouette glowed gold, as if for one last moment, it had come alive again. The father took his son's hand. "Come on," he said. "There's more to see." But before they left, the boy turned once more to the tank and whispered, "Thank you." The man didn't hear him. Maybe no one did. But the words lingered, the kind of quiet gratitude that history rarely records, yet always carries. Because in the end, the Sherman wasn't a symbol of destruction. It was proof of what people could do when they refused to surrender, when they turned fear into fuel and steel into strength. Hitler had once laughed at the idea that Americans could fight a mechanized war. Detroit answered with 50,000 reasons why he was wrong. And when the counting was done, when the smoke cleared and the world began again, one truth remained, carved not in marble, but in memory. Wars aren't won by hatred. They're won by those who keep building when everything else falls apart. And somewhere in the heart of that old tank, under the museum lights, it almost sounded like the engine was still ticking, slow, steady, eternal.